Nazywam się Alicjaczanka. Jestem absolwentką Uniwersytetu Warszawskiego. Skończyłam Uniwersytet Warszawski, historię w 1983 roku, akurat na sam koniec stanu wojennego. Więc wiadomo, że na Uniwersytecie Warszawskim nic a nic żeśmy nie mówili. Wszyscy byliśmy po prostu niemi, jeśli chodzi o sprawy Katynia. Nawet w stanie wojennym niewiele naprawdę prowadzonych było zajęć na uniwersytecie. Właściwie ciągle to było tak, że każdy mógł tylko liczyć na własne indywidualne jakieś badania, odkrycia. No i oczywiście prawdę przekazywano w domu. I tu jest to właśnie tak, jak to no być może należy podchodzić do tych poziomów pamięci. Pamięć subiektywna, pamięć obiektywna, no i oczywiście pamięć w pamiętnikach czy w powieściach, szczególnie na emigracji, i postpamięć na podstawie oczywiście tych wszystkich źródeł, które możemy w Muzeum Katyńskim też oglądać. Ale dla mnie najważniejsze, dla mnie właśnie studentki Uniwersytetu Warszawskiego historii było to, że ja właśnie odkrywałam to miejsce tak bardzo tajemnicze, bo to jest secret place, secret in many level, in landscape area, in internation East Europe area, but this place was installed at West Outskirt, Russia, and we installed in area no, nie do zidentyfikowania, jeśli chodzi o narodowość, unidentified nationality. It's very important, this level memory and post-memory. Dlaczego ja o tym mówię? Powiedziałam to po angielsku, specjalnie, żebyście Państwo to zrozumieli, badając oczywiście to wszystko na Zachodzie, bo my w Polsce nawet tego nie rozumiemy. Ja na przykład właśnie jak czytałam wspomnienia o tym, jak bojownicy właściwie to wysłannicy AK docierali do jakiegoś ogrodzenia, a za tym ogrodzeniem to nie wiadomo co było, a ludzie różne rzeczy tam mieszkający opowiadali. To tego nie rozumiałam, nie potrafiłam sobie tego wyobrazić nawet. Co tam mogło być? No okazywało się, że tam mógł być ośrodek wypoczynkowy. I to się wszystko dokonywało oczywiście właśnie, egzekucje odbywały się właściwie na terenie ośrodka wypoczynkowego, na terenie w ogóle dość rozległym. Więc to jest ten secret place, secret in many level. Dopiero oczywiście jak w 1994 roku udało nam się z grupą znajomych wyjechać do Katynia. No jeszcze oczywiście polski rząd nie zdecydował się tam wtedy jeszcze na zainwestowanie ogromnych pieniędzy w tą ochronę pamięci. To zrozumiałam, bo myśmy stali przy tym krzyżu właśnie, a wokół nas po prostu sobie ludzie najzwyczajniej w świecie spacerowali, no bo wypoczywali. A gdzie się znajdowały te doły właśnie z zakopanymi ciałami, to naprawdę było, mimo że mieliśmy mapy, ciężko znaleźć. Secret place.
Bardzo dziękuję. Anna Zaleska, archeolog i historyk. Można po polsku. Chciałam zapytać, ponieważ nie zdołałam ani w kodzie, ani w książce, którą dopiero teraz kartkuję, dotrzeć do treści Państwa opinii, recepcji samej wystawy muzealnej tam w Katyniu. Przyznam, że uderzył mnie tam kolosalny z punktu widzenia odbiorcy Polaka brak podpisów w języku polskim. Czy Państwo próbowaliście się jakoś ustosunkować do tego języka przekazu? Tam są narracje w języku rosyjskim i angielskim i przyznam, że jest to brak dojmujący, zwłaszcza dla reprezentantów starszego pokolenia, którzy jakby nie mogą recypować tych treści po angielsku, a szczęśliwie zapomnieli rosyjskiego. I stąd moje pytanie, czy same reprezentacje muzealne były przedmiotem Państwa rozważań, czy może mi umknął ten wątek? I druga sprawa, wydaje mi się, że Pan użył takiego odniesienia, że Katyn przestał być materialny i zaczął być symboliczny. No i jako ten touchstone dla wszystkich innych obszarów, w których te osoby zostały pochowane, jak najbardziej adekwatne usymbolizowanie. Natomiast chciałabym prosić o komentarz, na czym polega w Pana odbiorze ta dychotomia, ponieważ dla mnie to jest raczej pewne kontinuum i rzecz nie do rozróżnienia.
Jeszcze jedno pytanie od Zuzanny Bogumił, a potem... To za chwilę. Dobrze, to proszę o tutaj, przepraszam.
Alexander Zamaleva, Galley School for Social Research. I'd like to ask you a question about the so-called anti-Katyn. It's the issue which is now raised in Russia, first of all, and now it was raised 20 years ago, but especially now. It's an alleged massacre of Polish prisoners, of Bolshevik prisoners of war by Polish authorities in the 20s. And I know that this issue is raised now in Russia to minimize the significance of the Katyn. And it's never very much popular in Russia, but I would like to ask you, what is the reception of this myth in a countries neighboring Russia, or it's linked only to Russia? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for all these really interesting questions. Maybe I'll go first to the question of the museum in Katyn. There is a whole chapter in the book on the topic of the museum. Unfortunately, Julie Feder, our colleague who went there and did the research, is not here. She could talk at length about that. I mean, I think perhaps related also to what you were saying about the site. It's a very complicated site. It's a complex place with lots of where different memories interrelate and different ways of remembering interrelate and sometimes come into conflict with one another. I mean, yeah, I agree with you that if there are no Polish information in Polish, I guess it's not satisfactory at all. Well, maybe anti-Katyn, but this was also something which we looked at a bit in the research for the book. I mean, I think it's part of the, coming back to the issue of Katyn in Russia and how Katyn is dealt with in Russia. There has been a tendency to this kind of gradual but always incomplete admission of Soviet or guilt of Stalin and NKVD for the crime, but always qualifying these admissions, for example, with certain rationalizations for the murder and for the crime. So Katyn happened, and this was a tragedy, and we agreed, but it happened because X, Y, Z, and this anti-Katyn was one of these things which was raised, starting from, I think, the early 90s, really. It was, as far as I understand, research into this topic was pretty much commissioned specifically to balance the Polish claims about the Katyn massacre. That's not to say that the death of these Soviet soldiers is not a tragedy. Of course it is, but whether these things are connected, whether they are even comparable things is very questionable, of course. And this is, we're really talking about a political strategy of qualifying. Yes, it's true, the Soviets did this, but adding these kind of buts and certain rationalizations, which maybe don't justify, but rationalize, explain in some way. Because in many ways, as a chapter on Russia, which was written mainly by Alexander Etkind, looks at the fact that the massacre itself does, in many ways, looks like a senseless decision. It's very difficult actually to understand why the decision was made when 1 year later, Polish officers were enlisted en masse into the Soviet armed forces.
I'd like to address. Thank you, all of you, for these provocative questions. I'd like to first address this concept of post-memory, because I think with respect to Katyn and Poland, we see a remarkable kind of post-memory. You may be aware of the work of Marian Hirsch from Columbia University, who's done a great deal of work with respect to post-memory of the Holocaust, how subsequent generations of victims of the Holocaust remember and seem to remember as if the Holocaust happened to them in some strange way. How these feelings, the affect that Matilda and Uilleam were talking about before, can rest inside of someone. In the case of Katyn, obviously, this type of post-memory is not a simple transmission in the case of the Holocaust that we see. It's very much a pursuit. There was a struggle to remember Katyn, to fight, to determine what happened, to uncover secrets, to delve deeply into what these secrets signify. And in many respects, I think this book can help for those who aren't aware of Katyn, who aren't aware of, let's say, the history and the very fraught, complex, tortured histories of post-Stalinist Eastern Europe. It can introduce to scholars in North America and Western Europe and beyond to the kinds of ways Katyn teaches us, not only about the actual event itself, but how communities in Poland and beyond sought to remember it, how it became so important, and exercised very profound political and social influence. The museum is a fascinating case, because it is in Russia the only monument to Stalinist terror that exists. It has federal status. It is the only monument. It was, first of all, the museum and the monument was opened in 2000. It was the second to open. The first opened in Katyn outside of Kharkiv, primarily due to Polish funding and Polish activity in the case of Ukraine. In the case of Katyn in Russia, it was a joint collaboration. There was concern about how not to conflate and combine Polish suffering and Russian suffering, so they've divided them. The Russian part of the museum is a fascinating example of the ways in which architects, state officials, other cultural figures struggled to present the memory of Stalinist terror in Russia. It's still very much an incomplete project. We have examples of the architects, including one by the surname of Shangin, who believes, in fact, that Katyn is more important for Russia than it is for Poland. Many controversial concepts that they've taken up in constructing this museum. But with respect to the anti-Katyn, as you mentioned, it's become very much a popular topic, one might say, in Russia. Vladimir Putin, after Lech Kaczynski's aircraft crashed, mentioned the anti-Katyn as an explanation for why Katyn happened in 1940. There's a very bizarre logic in Putin's formulation. Because if we argue for a moment that Stalin executed the Polish officers in 1940 because Polish or representatives of Poland took the lives of the Red Army, then the national component comes into play in a very profound way, which leaves open the legal accusation of genocide. Putin's formulation introduces the concept of ethnicity and nationality because of the use of anti-Katyn, and therefore makes, I think, a very persuasive case for Katyn being a genocide. This is something I think Putin himself would not subscribe to say the least, but nonetheless he introduces it in his logic. In my experience, and maybe my colleagues will have different remarks about this, neighboring countries, I'm thinking specifically of Ukraine, aren't very influenced by the concept of the anti-Katyn. It's maybe marginal, a minority of people talk about it. It's very much something that plays more in Russia due to this issue that Russia has of being effectively the perpetrator, or at least the legal successor of the perpetrator, the Soviet state.
Thank you for your question. I'd just like to very briefly address this question of material versus symbolic. It's a very interesting point you make about the afterlife of Katyn and whether the material remains of it, the relics of the crime, have any role to play. Of course, the connection between the material effects and the symbolic memory events, the different films, literature, the different political statements, is a complex one. It's a very complex relationship. But at least in the case of Belarus, I think it's very important that the evidence we are missing in order to talk about Katyn properly in Belarus, and also I believe in some cases in Ukraine. I mean, there's still so much that we don't know physically about the history of Katyn. And what we're missing is material evidence. Whether it will be found, whether the actual piece of paper bearing those names of the Białoruska Lista Katyńska will be found, whether any more actual military remains will be found in the ground, is yet to be seen. But if that material evidence is found, then it will have another interesting memory effect, and it will lead to more interesting memory events.